Hello, and welcome to the Young Heretics episode in which I explain absolutely everything that is happening to you right now. What is happening right now is the country is falling apart. America, where I am filming this and recording this, and probably where you are if you're listening to me, America is in a profound moment of civil unrest and turmoil. I don't think that anybody will be surprised to hear you say this. There is looting going on. There has been looting and rioting going on. People are tearing down statues. People are having convulsions over whether or not they should have a town named Columbus because Christopher Columbus they feel was evil, or they're tearing down statues of Lincoln and the founding fathers were all evil, and so forth. This is not a small or minor thing, right? This is a tremendous and kind of terrifying moment. If you're a conservative like me, you have a very specific sort of outlook on this, which is that basically that it is all terrible. But even if you're not, right, even if you're not a conservative and you're listening to me, you have to look at this and think, well, we're not in a good state, right? I mean, you can take whatever political view that you want on the present moment, but nobody can look at this and think yes, this is a healthy America, right? This is America where everything is fine and we're all happy. And so that is actually the point of this episode, because it occurred to me as I was watching this sort of unfolding American catastrophe that if we had an academy in this country, right, if there were healthy universities and colleges out there teaching, this would be the academy's moment to shine, because this is the perfect time when you want to take a step back out of the headlines and think, well, it's a momentous time in our history. What wisdom can we draw from the past, from similar moments in our history that might sort of help us to understand and to weather this moment? That would be the job of actual academics and actual professors if we had them. Instead, right, in Cambridge, there are professors literally tweeting things like, white lives don't matter. So kind of part of the premise of this show is the academy is the bad guys. Yeah, the academy is part of the problem. And one of the things that we are doing here is we are offering one another, I am offering you, and we are sharing the classical education that we all should have had, but a lot of us got denied because things are breaking down so utterly in the academy. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do what academics should be doing right now, which is looking out at the turmoil in America and trying to understand it, trying to understand moments in history that are like what we're going through right now. What's funny about that is that whenever somebody tries to do that, whenever you say, what are similar moments in history this time, you get these very kind of basic one-to-one comparisons, right? You get Trump is literally Hitler, or oh my gosh, we're going through exactly the French Revolution right now. You get these just sort of, this person is that person, or this event is that event. And that's not really helpful to me, right? I don't find that very helpful because history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Yeah, this is an old saying that you don't get just one historical moment from the past lifted and copied and pasted into this present moment. And it's not the most helpful way to read history, to kind of go back and be we're going through the same moment again. It is helpful, I think, to notice when certain dynamics are repeating, when certain kind of relationships between different classes of people are similar to the relationships that existed in the past, right? I talked a while back when we talked about the Persians, I talked about this concept of anacyclosis, which is a fancy Greek word for the cycle of regimes, that certain kinds of constitutions, certain kinds of countries tend to kind of move from one thing to another in a sort of predictable fashion. And those larger trends, those larger sort of dynamic trends are, I think, the kinds of comparisons that are genuinely helpful. So if you can find a moment where the dynamics are similar to our dynamics, then you're getting somewhere. Then you are looking at a moment in history that might actually have some wisdom to teach you and to draw from. And I actually think that there is such a moment from ancient history, and so that is what this episode is about. And we may return to this period in time fairly often on this show, because this isn't going to go away, right? It's not like this week we'll be doing the end of the American Republic and next week we'll be doing everything's fine and dandy. Like, this is an ongoing situation that we're dealing with here, and I want to kind of come back repeatedly to this historical parallel and revisit it. What I have in mind is the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic, which is like kind of a scary thing to say, because it sounds like, oh, we're necessarily at the beginning of the end of our American Republic. I don't think that that's what this necessarily means at all. I don't think that the cycle of regimes is destiny, and I don't think that historical parallels mean we're doomed to repeat the same thing. In fact, one of the reasons that I'm spending time studying this moment right now is because I think if you study history, you can actually figure out how to deal with problems better by looking at how people tried and failed to deal with them in the past. So we are going to talk on this episode about the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. This is sometimes called the period of the Gracchi because it has to do with these two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, who some people have called them kind of early populists. Actually, our pal Barry Strauss, the honorary heretic that we had on in episode 3, wrote a really nice essay in the New Criterion about the Gracchi and sort of this period of populism in Roman history. And we're going to get into that, but we also are just going to, first we're going to spend some time just talking about this period around 133 BC and thereabouts. And then at the end, after we've genuinely studied that period in depth, we will try to draw some parallels and see what we can learn about this ancient moment to take into our moment. The big idea, the takeaway that I hope we are going to draw out of this, because I think this is what I really learned from this moment, is you cannot undo the injustice of the past, no matter how tempting it is. It's always incredibly tempting when there is real injustice in the past to find some way of undoing its effects, of kind of winding the clock back. And that's what this moment in ancient Rome is about. I think it's what our moment is about. It's about that desire to undo everything that went wrong in the generations before yours by undoing its effects. And I think that one of the big lessons from this ancient Roman moment is that whatever the solution is, it's not that. So, okay, in order to get into this, we need to understand a little bit about the bigger story of ancient Rome, about the class dynamics in Rome, and about how the Constitution worked by the time we get to 133 BC. So let's just back up quite a bit. Rome is known, it's kind of known for its Republican period and its imperial period, so it's known as a Republican empire. But before it was either of those things, it was a monarchy, right? It was a kingdom. And they kicked out their kings. They had a revolution in 509 BC. They kicked out this king, Tarquinius Superbus was his name. All these guys have great names. Anyway, they kicked out Tarquinius Superbus, 509 BC, whereupon Rome went through a series of social upheavals, which were not violent. So after they ousted the monarchy, they did not have violent civil unrest immediately for quite some time, actually. But they did have a bunch of kind of class struggle and class squabbles. Before Tarquinius Superbus, there had been a series of reforms under this king Servius Tullius. And some of these reforms are kind of more legend than history, but it just tells you kind of where they were, right? Once they kicked the kings out, they had this assembly of people called the Comitia Curiata. Comitia Curiata was a group of sort of kinship groups, basically. And it was a way of organizing the Roman populace according to kinship groups. And it was a fundamentally classist way. You have in Rome these two kind of sets of people. There's the patricians, which is a few families, and those are the nobility. And you have the plebeians, and the plebeians are the poor or just the working class, and they are attached. Each plebeian family in this early stage is attached to a patrician family, and so they're basically not independent. It's basically the patricians that run things. And as Rome moves into its Republican period, that's sort of still where they are, yeah? But Servius kind of reforms some of this, and institutes what's called the Comitia Centuriata. And so that's the new kind of version of voting that they have in place, which at least allows plebeians to kind of be involved in the government without being just directly attached to a patrician family. Yeah. And so that's where we are at the beginning. We have a class hierarchy, but we also have this kind of new mode of voting, because a comitia centuriata or what have you, a comitia was the source of sovereignty in Rome. Once you move into the Republican period, these assemblies of citizens, which is all non-slave men over 17, these assemblies of citizens become the source of sovereignty. They become, where you pass laws, and the people who get to elect magistrates, the votes of these comitiae are what sort of make the final decision about all of these things. And they ratify war and peace, right? Is the other thing they say when Rome is going to war. There is a Senate, famously, right? Rome has a Senate. Technically, the Senate serves an advisory function. It's formed of all present and former magistrates, so all present and former consuls. We'll get into some of these different magistrates, but sort of people who have served in public office become the Senate. But technically, it's the comitiae that really make the decisions. So you have the Comitia Centuriata, which is sort of established by Servius Tullius and then continues on into the Republican period. And it's called the Comitia Centuriata because it's formed out of centuries, which is a group of people. It's not a group of 100 people. It kind of sounds like it should be, but it's not, right? And each of those centuries gets one vote, and there's 5 classes based on property. So if you're in the top class, you have the most land, basically, and then you have, going down the line. And then below that 5, there's like the super poor. There's it's called infraclassum, below the class. So they get 1 century, right? But the super rich, right, get a ton of votes. So there are 70 centuries for the first class and 18 for the knights, which is kind of another elite order. And then for everybody else, there's 105 centuries. And so remember, each century is 1 vote, which means this is like an openly elitist system. If you win over the first class and the knights, you've basically won. And the more unanimous the rich are, the less the poor count in this original system. And so obviously that's like kind of a bum deal for plebeians, right? For people that are not super rich. And as a consequence, what you have between about 500 and 278 BC, so for a long period, you have a series of kind of upheavals, and in some cases, something like a strike, an ancient version of a strike, where the plebs, who form a lot of the military, right? So they have that power going for them. And again, like any middle to lower class, they are the backbone of the economy, and without them, you actually can't do anything. It doesn't matter how rich and fancy you are, right? You need some kind of buy-in in any society from the mass of people, even if they're buying into a monarchy, right? Never mind a republic. Even if you're living under a monarchy, you still need some kind of like popular support from just the dudes, the common people. And that's why, as it's called the conflict of the orders, this sort of ongoing series of plebeian revolts, which is quite effective, and it ends up with a number of different reforms. One thing that they accomplish over this time period is plebeians become allowed to hold public office. So as I mentioned in Rome, right, there are a number of magistrates. There are 2 consuls elected every year, and those are kind of you can think of them as like almost a joint presidency. They are 2 generals. They lead the army into war. But that's, in many ways, that's the kind of highest honor, although there are a few other sort of elder statesman honors that we'll get into. But the other thing that happens over the course of the conflict of the orders is a new comitia is formed. So a new source of sovereignty now exists in Rome, which that's a huge deal, right? If you think about it, like in any constitution, the thing that really matters, like where does power rest? And right now, as we are we've been doing this even, before we got into all this civil unrest, we have been having a series of arguments basically about who gets to decide things in the last analysis, right? And this idea that we have in the modern West about popular sovereignty even if people don't know exactly what popular sovereignty is, that's what's making them so mad, right? That's why Brexit, for example, was such a contentious and is still such a contentious thing in the UK, because the people who are supposed to be the last word decided they were going to do something. And then the elites were kind of like, but what if we didn't? And then people were like, no, but we really, really want to. And then the elites were like, but no. And so the more you have these kind of back and forths between the people who are supposed to be in charge and then the people who actually hold the levers of power, the more heated and intense things get. And so once you form, in Rome, when they formed this new comitia, they were basically investing more people with that final say, which obviously was a really big deal. And the way the comitia, it's called the Comitia Tributa, because it's divided into 35 tribes, right? And those are not based on kinship. So it's not like the curiae, which were back in the kind of the olden days, which are sort of related to these wealthy patrician families. It's the Comitia Tributa is kind of these groups of people, and they each get one vote. So that changes things entirely. If you can't win in the Comitia Contoriata, where you have this kind of hugely classist system, then you can perhaps win in the Comitia Tributa, where people are much more equal, right? Remember, again, this is all men over 17 who are not slaves, are citizens in Rome. Now, there's a slight kind of nuance which Roman authors themselves don't really care that much about, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I'm just going to note that technically you have the Comitia Tributa, which is everybody, patricians and plebeians. And then you also have the concilium or the concilium plebis, which is the council of plebeians, and that's only plebeians. So they even get out of this conflict of the orders, they get kind of their own special area to work and vote. And most importantly, for our purposes, the Comitia Tributa is in charge of electing the tribunes of the plebs. And the tribunes of the plebs are 10 each year, and they're kind of, they're sort of like the plebs version of the consuls, even though at this point, everybody can be consul, right? As we move through the conflict of the orders, all people, regardless of their patrician or plebeian status, can become a consul. But it's still way, way easier to win with the rich if you're part of their upper crust set, right? So technically, the tribune of the plebs is supposed to be this place that's a little bit more egalitarian. And one of the interesting things that this ends us up with is it ends us up in a system not unlike the American one, in that it's a bicameral legislature, right? One of which is based on kind of more direct representation. We have the House of Representatives, they have the Comitia Tributa. The other one is based sort of more on an older style of assessing, kind of not through direct equality, but through sort of proportional representation, assessing sort of who gets to make the decisions in the state. So they've got a setup that is not unlike ours in this way. But the other important thing to remember, right, is when you hear Tribune of the Plebs, you may have already heard it as like a kind of thing in common parlance, the Tribune of the Plebs. It sounds like the man of the people, right? But this is going to be really important for both for the American moment that we're talking about and for the Roman moment, is that when you open up political office to the plebs, what does not happen is that then, like, the great unwashed masses are suddenly set free and have their voices heard. What actually happens is that some of the plebeians who couldn't do this before now can move into the upper classes. And so instead of just a patrician upper class, you have a kind of slightly more mobile plebeian patrician upper class. It was still much harder. It was called, if you moved into, say, the consulship without having any former relatives who had done it, or without being related to or attached to a patrician family, this was still like an incredible feat. The most famous person who did this was Cicero, yeah? And Cicero was what's called a novus homo, a new man, because he kind of emerged seemingly out of nowhere into political power. And that is now happening because over the course of this time, there's sort of a greater sense of egalitarianism in the political system. But there is still an elite upper crust, and those of the elite upper crust who wish to claim to be, representatives of the people have to dance this kind of delicate dance where they're playing the power game, just like our elected representatives and senators do, while still claiming that they somehow represent the interests of the masses or what have you. So that's kind of where Rome is at politically at this point. It's gone on this journey from monarchy and pure sort of feudal elitism slowly into something that looks a little bit more American, into a kind of egalitarian system which has a class setup that is not like purely fixed and stable. That's where we are by 133, which is the period that we are going to talk about. Where are we in, like, culturally in Rome, right? Because that's the next question. What's going on at this moment? Because again, remember, what we're looking at here is a period in history that the Romans looked back on as the beginning of the end, right? We're going to talk in a moment about sort of the great historians of this period, but kind of universally, all of those historians say, you know, we had this conflict of the orders, we had this back and forth, we had kind of a lot of tension and sometimes very heated tension between different classes in our society. But nobody ever laid a hand on anybody else. There was never Romans taking arms against Romans until this moment in 133. And after that happened, everything went to pot. That is when we start to fall apart. That's why I'm paying attention to this moment right now, right? Because we too, in America, have had extremely heated and passionate debates within our society about who should be in charge, who should have power. We've had great injustice on that score before. But the reason that what we're doing now feels different is because since the Civil War, we have not had a massive explosion of violence from American to American. And the reason that we're comparing this to, say, the riots in the 90s is because that's kind of how we're feeling. And that's what Rome was going through in this moment. All the people that kind of look back on it were like, yeah, this is when violence really erupted. And so it was about politics, but it was also very much about society and class and culture. So kind of what's going on sociologically here, yeah? What's happening is Rome is getting huge. It's getting really, really big. And this has happened also to us, right? That Rome starts out, it thinks of itself as having started out as this just like ragtag bunch of farmers, basically. And their homespun virtue, their sort of personal integrity and their manliness, their courage, their fortitude, their willingness to go without in the name of the greater good, all of these things, they think of themselves as having these kind of homespun virtues that make them great. But over time, they start to conquer a ton of territory. And it's not that they don't think that they're worthy of it, right? They do. They think that this is the gods, bestowing upon them the greatness that their virtue merits. But I don't think that anybody really expected Rome to get as big as it had by this time. I mean, like, wow, right? So they get all of Italy, for one thing, from being just like a kind of burg in Italy. They get all of what is now Italy. They get territory in Greece in 146 BC at the Battle of Corinth. They begin basically to take over Greece, it's a small-ish territory, but it's a huge deal culturally because Greece is the gem of the Mediterranean, right? And we've talked already at great length, and we'll talk more about how awesome Greece was in this period. It had produced all this amazing stuff that the Romans themselves loved. And Horace, one of the great poets of a later period, of the Augustan period in the empire, Horace wrote that captive Greece conquered her savage conqueror, meaning that they were so enamored of Greece that when they took it over, they started to become Greek because they just loved so much about it. But so they've taken over Greece, which is a huge deal. They have a series of wars called the Punic Wars from 246 up to 146 BC. And that leads to the conquest of the Carthaginian Empire, which is in northern Africa. So now suddenly they're in Africa, which is like, holy crap, right? What the heck are these little like Italian peasant farmers doing in Africa? And this greatness comes with so much land, right? Since the Battle of Zama in 202, Scipio Africanus the Elder defeats Hannibal. We'll get into this on another episode, but Scipio and Hannibal fight, and they defeat the sort of Carthaginian invasion. And then they stage a counter invasion, which kind of just turns them into conquerors. And this is a big part of what makes them. Obviously, they're not an empire yet because they don't have an emperor, but they're becoming imperial. They're expanding out their territory, and they're getting just all of this wealth and riches out of it. And whenever you do that, just like in America when we expanded out westward, the question becomes, what do you do with it all? How are we going to distribute this wealth fairly? It's not the same really as when, if I produce a piece of writing or make a table, it's quite obvious that that's the fruit of my labor, and I'm going to be able to sell it or do whatever I want with it. But if we collectively conquer land, then there's this sort of big question on the table, which is like, okay, so who does it belong to? It can't just belong to everybody forever. You can't just give all of this land to kind of like Rome, full stop. And you have to think about, well, who's going to kind of own it, and what sort of power structures is that going to create, right? Because already a lot of the elitism, a lot of the class struggle in Rome is about who owns property, who owns land, who has wealth. And so now there's kind of the potential for yet more of that. And I think everybody, the Romans and us, kind of would have liked for the answer to be, well, the middle class is going to get this land. And I say that advisedly because, of course, right, in every society, and certainly in Rome, there was an interest on the part of the rich that they just sort of they felt entitled to everything. Really, the ideal is to have a kind of healthy middle to lower class, small landowner community in this new territory, farming the land, having kids, right, fighting in the military. They were not always, people in the conquered territories of Rome were not always full citizens, and there was a whole separate set of social unrest about kind of who was going to get citizenship. But by and large, especially in Italy, where the Romans basically thought they were like related to everybody, they thought this was all kind of a common Italian stock. There was this sense that if we could get these Italian farmers out there working the land, that would be a healthy sort of backbone for this new, vastly expanded republic. Because it is always a question, right? The founders of America worried about this just as much. How big you can make any representative government, any government where there is some form of popular sovereignty. It's like, how big can you get before the values start eroding, before everybody's thinking different things and living according to different rules, and nobody's really participating in the same, nobody's really on the same page, which is another kind of dynamic, I think, that we're feeling right now. Yeah, I mean, we do in America have this healthy and important sense of what you might call multiculturalism in the old sense, right? That we're capable of incorporating new cultures and people from other countries into our republic. But we also, at least back in the day, when we started out on this whole venture, part of what we thought was, well, what we'll do is we'll take those people and welcome them into our sort of Anglophone legal tradition, our Republican way of life and way of doing things. And when you lose that center, when that center cannot hold, as the poet Yeats would have said, right? When you lose that, you get just kind of a hodgepodge, right? You get a bunch of people who don't agree with each other, don't recognize one another as fellow citizens, right? So this is the problem that republics have as they grow. And it was a problem that Rome was having that could have been alleviated if they had managed to really do this thing where they basically farmed this new land with, good, hearty peasant farmers. Because again, remember, Rome thought of themselves as essentially that, as essentially sort of good, hearty, homespun peasant farmer stock. And the new sort of elaborate functioning of this sort of proto-empire, this nascent empire, was in many ways a move away from what they thought was best about them. Even the ones that were kind of doing the empire, doing the imperial stuff, sort of, it would have been great to have like a new class, a new generation and a new class of kind of homespun farmers. That did not happen. Instead, the rich just like took a lot of land, basically. They got a lot of land. And there were actually laws to prevent this, right? In 367 BC, they passed the Licinio-Sexton law, or the Lex Licinia, it's sometimes called, which said that no individual could have more than 500 jugera of land. This is the jugerum is a Roman measurement. 500 jugera is like about half a square mile. So not a huge territory, but not a tiny territory either. And this Lex Licinia kind of limits people to that space so that you can get lots of people on this land, each having kind of a stake in the land. People ignore this entirely. This is like, people obeyed this law like we obey immigration law in the US, right? There was just like no respect for it. There were all sorts of forms of kind of subterfuge to get around it. People sold the land basically to themselves. So you'd be like, oh, I have my 500 jugera, and then I'm going to sell. So, I, Spencer, have my 500 jugera, and then I'm going to sell another 500 jugera to Sally Spencerion, like this other person that is actually me, right? And they did that. They gave it away as part of dowries for their daughters. They, basically they quote unquote gave it or sold it to relatives, but then basically kept possession of it. There was just a tremendous amount of disregard for the Lex Licinia, basically ineffective at this point. And increasingly, by the time the late 100s BC come along, increasingly what the rich are doing is they're farming this land with slaves. And, there is a little bit of wiggle room in the term slave in the ancient world. So sometimes when you say that, you actually mean kind of like not the sort of horrifying moral atrocity that was chattel slavery in the US and Europe and sort of in the modern period. But it looks like this slavery was pretty bad. It looks like this was, basically just exploiting human people as if they were animals, right? So there was the moral injustice of it. And we feel that, right? We moderns feel that. For Romans, in addition to that, there was also the fact that land could have been farmed by sort of citizens or at least Italians, right? Kind of people that would then go serve in the military, people that would be part of, active parts of Rome and eventually vote and all that stuff. But the rich didn't want that. They didn't want even to kind of own the land and then have middle-class people farm it. Because slaves, you can just exploit, right? That's the whole thing about slaves. And that's what makes it such an atrocity, is that you don't have to really think too hard about, buying them nice food or paying them a living wage or any of this stuff. And they certainly don't necessarily have to go off and serve in the army, right? So this is this way to just get, all of this free or cheap labor for the rich, and it completely disenfranchises the working poor and middle class, right? People around this time, people are beginning to feel just totally disheartened and dismayed about their prospects. They stop having kids, which is another interesting parallel with our time, right? They just don't think that they can make enough money, basically, to support kids. And so they with the kids go the hope for the future, right? If you are not having kids, you are making an active statement in your own way of life that you don't think, assuming you can have kids and want to, but you just don't. You're saying, I don't think that this world is kind of good enough or hopeful enough to bring young people into. And so that is also happening among the middle class. And when the Gracchi start to enter into political power, there is this enormous amount of popular despondency and resentment. People are starting to feel angry, and they have, for a while, felt listless and despairing. When you start talking about slaves, obviously a very, hot button and incredibly incendiary issue, the first comparison in America that everybody wants to make is with our period of slavery. But actually, the right comparison here, I think, is with our history of struggle with illegal immigration, right? It's the problem of having laws on the books that you don't follow, which leads to this disenfranchised underclass that is totally mistreated, right? Illegal immigrants in this country are terribly, terribly mistreated in many cases by their employers because they can, because all of these laws that we have in America that protect American workers don't apply to people that don't have green cards or visas or what have you. And meanwhile, all of those people who are supposedly protected by those laws are actually put out of work by them. And so you get this huge resentful sort of citizen class that is resentful of this mistreated underclass that is both classes are being manipulated by the rich, right? And this transcends politics. I mean, one of the reasons that people get very frustrated with sort of our patrician Republicans, right? Our patricians who, say that they care about things like illegal immigration and then just, are happy to have their lawns mowed and watered by illegal immigrants and therefore don't have a fire under their ass to really get this problem fixed, right? There's a very, very similar dynamic going on here, that the rich are very, very happy to have this problem because for them, all it basically means is just wealth. It just means getting rich. And just as now in the election of Donald Trump and in even, on the right we have the election of Donald Trump, on the left we have this kind of explosion of socialism, you have these kind of popular expressions of just like, stop doing this, right? Stop grinding us under your heel, left and right, are saying this. That's the same, again, you see why I think of this period as kind of close to ours, right? That's the same popular resentment that we're seeing taking to the streets right now. This sense of hopelessness, I can't have kids, I can't make money, the laws don't mean anything, right? All of that vibe, all of that feeling is out there, and there's this intensity of popular resentment in ancient Rome. And just like now, when that happens, what you think is going to come next is a popular uprising and the liberation of the people, because there's all this popular energy behind it. But more often than not, what happens instead is that a sophisticated, smart, educated, talented, wealthy person comes along and figures out the right way to brand himself as the man of the people. And then that person can do almost anything. There's almost no limit. This is why people get worried about demagogues and demagoguery, right? Because there's almost no limit to what somebody can do if he can convincingly portray himself as the representative of a mass mob of resentment, but in fact be somebody that is very good at pulling the levers of power and manipulating power. And so that's what you have. I think that's what you have now. I mean, when you see, for example, when you see Democrat congresspeople kneeling in kente cloth, which is an act of complete ignorance and misunderstanding about what kente cloth is and who they are in relation to this mob, which will happily eat them alive, right? That's an example of somebody trying to do this, kind of ineptly. Like Nancy Pelosi is kind of an inept version of this, where you have somebody just trying to kind of act out the feeling, the kind of raw emotion that's going on out in the world as a way of hopefully, marshaling it and channeling it into her own power. That's what happens in ancient Rome. The Gracchi, whom we're now going to get to, are kind of the people that cracked this code and figured out how they were going to translate all the mob resentment into political power. So the Gracchi are two brothers. We're going to talk today about the first brother. We'll do another episode on the second brother. But the eldest brother is Tiberius. And he is most certainly not a sort of man of the poor people. He's not like you're just a peasant farmer. He's the son of the elder Tiberius Gracchus, who fought under the great Scipio Africanus, who beat Hannibal at Zama. So he's got that in his background. So we will now get into the life of Tiberius Gracchus. But before we sort of launch into that, let me just pause and say thank you so much for being a part of this show, for listening or watching wherever you are. It's really awesome to hear all of your feedback and to know that you're out there listening. Obviously, I love this material, but I love even more to share it with you and hear your thoughts about it. If you have not already, please subscribe. That will help you to get new episodes, and it will help us to know whom we're reaching. And especially if you really want to help, you can give a 5-star review on iTunes, because that is hugely encouraging. I love reading the reviews. It's so fun to see what people think. But 2, please do leave us a 5-star review. It's really helpful to us, or at least keep your bad opinions to yourself. All right, so having said that, let us launch into the life of Tiberius Gracchus. So just to sort of reorient us to where we are, Plutarch, who is one of the historians of this period, in his life of Tiberius Gracchus, he was a biographer, he wrote a life of Tiberius Gracchus. He says, the poor who had been ejected from their land no longer showed themselves eager for military service and neglected the bringing up of children, so that soon all Italy was conscious of a dearth of freemen and was filled with gangs of foreign slaves, by whose aid the rich cultivated their estates from which they had driven away the free citizens. So that's the setup. Enter Tiberius Gracchus, who is not a man of the people. He's elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BC. But he's the absolute cream of the crop, right? His father, the elder Tiberius, was a war hero. He married the daughter of the elder Scipio Africanus. So the father of Tiberius the elder marries the daughter of this great war hero who won the Battle of Zama against Hannibal. And the younger Tiberius, our Tiberius that we're interested in, was the son-in-law of Appius Claudius, who was what's called the princeps senatus. He's kind of the senator who presides over the Senate, the chief of the Senate, it's sometimes translated. And so Appius Claudius' daughter, Claudia, marries Tiberius Gracchus. And so he is connected, man. He's like, just the it thing. He's the Cory Booker, or that's a bad comparison because Cory Booker is so feckless, but like he's like a better version of Cory Booker, He's an expert in rhetoric. Plutarch says that he has a gentle and sedate style. So his younger brother Gaius, whom we'll get to, was a much more fiery, sort of passionate, intense person. And we'll get to his career later on. But Tiberius is composed and sedate, and therefore highly, highly effective, because he knows how to marshal these hot-headed crowds and represent himself as invested in their struggles without himself losing his own head, which is, a tremendous skill if what you're trying to do is kind of manipulate this moment into your own gain. Now, I don't want to talk Tiberius down too much here. It's easy to do that because he's the kind of first step on the road to the dissolution of the Roman Republic. But, by all accounts, he was a great guy. He was talented, dynamic, interesting, fun, and he just came of age in a moment when the sort of aristocracy was sclerotic. It was a do-nothing aristocracy. There was this massive problem, and, it was as much the time as Tiberius that meant that Tiberius had to turn to what effectively became demagoguery. So let's just talk a little bit about sort of our sources here for this, right? Because unlike previous episodes, we're not just looking at one book. We have a number of different sources for the life of Tiberius and the life of Gaius. We have mostly later sources for this, actually. I mentioned Plutarch already. He's the great biographer and essayist, Greek essayist who lived in the 1st and 2nd century AD. So he's a little bit later than this period in 133 BC. So interestingly, our only continuous narrative source for this period is Appian of Alexandria. So we've got tons of history of Rome. Livy famously writes a monumental history of Rome, but it does not, what we have does not cover this period. It does not survive, at least, whatever he may have written about the Gracchi. And Appian, who is 2nd century AD historian, does cover this period, but he's kind of a mess. Appian also wrote a monumental history of Rome. It was this sort of sweeping story of Rome from its earliest beginnings up through its imperial period. And this is the section, within that massive work, there is a section called the Civil Wars that deals with precisely this moment when everything starts to sort of break out into actual physical violence. And we're right at the beginning of that section. And so when we deal with Appian, we have to be a little bit kind of nervous because, sometimes he gets things wrong. He gets a lot of details about how the Senate works wrong and all this stuff. But it seems like he has pretty good, we don't actually really know what his sources were for this period, but it seems like he has pretty good ones. I mean, there were things that were still around, like the speeches of the Gracchi were still around, the memoirs of Sulla, who came a little bit later, were still around, and he had Plutarch, probably. Although we actually, again, we don't know whether he's using Plutarch or what, but it's not terribly far out. It's late, but it's not super late. So we feel like we basically have, between Plutarch and Appian, we basically have a reliable account, but that's just a note about sort of whom we're reading here. And again, Appian, like most writers on this period, thinks that this was the beginning of the end. This is when things really started to get bad. He says from 133 and onward, Appian says, undisciplined arrogance soon became the rule, along with a shameful contempt for law and justice. By the way, it's become my habit to recommend editions on this show, and John Carter's, I guess it's a Penguin Classics edition, I'm holding it up if you can see me, of Appian's Civil Wars. Really nice, great notes, and a nice translation. So that's what I'm using here on this show, and I recommend it. So anyway, so Appian says, this was this period of untempered arrogance and shameful contempt for law and justice. And this is even though Appian is kind of like pro-empire. He's kind of into the Roman Empire, but he still thinks that this was a shameful period of turmoil. So even if you think that what comes after the turmoil is good, you can still kind of look back on this moment and think like, wow, this was bad. This was not good. So, and Livy actually seems to sort of feel the same thing. Livy, who's very pro-Rome. Again, we don't have his writing on this period, but in his preface to the whole history, he says, Livy lived shortly after this period, and he says, at this point, the might of a long paramount nation is wasting by internal decay. So there's not generally people who lived around this time or who looked back on this time were like not super stoked about it. The question is, right, how does this great guy, this noble, sedate, interesting fellow, urbane, erudite fellow, end up lighting the match that was going to burn the entire house down, right? Here's the story. The first thing he tried to do is he tried to enforce the Lex Licinia. He tried to restore everybody to 500 Eugera, this smaller space of land. And he had help from his buddy, whose name is Mucius Scaevola, which is another great name. And Scaevola was a jurist, so he would have been very sort of sophisticated about how he put the terms of this law together. And Plutarch says this was, in general, it was kind of a gentle law. It basically it was a new law, Tiberius's new agrarian law, basically just puts the Lex Licinia back into effect. And much like, some immigration reform that kind of gets plastered all over the headlines, it's basically just enforcing the law. It's like, this is already the law, now we're just gonna bring the hammer down and enforce it. However, of course, as I already mentioned, all of this land is tangled up in many cases, generational, aggregation. A lot of people have sold, the injustice in many cases is like 2 generations back, that some guy had a rich grandfather who sold this big parcel of land, and so now they just have this thing, or they have them, and then what are you going to do with the money from that sale? And so there's all of these things that you have to sort out, even with this kind of mild, gentle, just like let's go back and obey the law, right? And so Tiberius is presenting this, remember, to the council of the plebs, or the comitia tributa, either one, and he is trying to get it passed, and he makes this amazing speech. This is from Plutarch. Plutarch records, in the ancient world, people were much more free with sort of recording the exact words of a speech, even if they maybe weren't there. So what they did is they kind of knew the general outlines of the speech, and then they would compose in what they thought was the style of the orator. So we have this speech. It's not entirely clear how exact it is, but it's probably pretty close. And some version of this is what Gracchus said. The wild beasts that roam over Italy have every one of them a cave or lair to lurk in. But the men who fight and die for Italy enjoy the common air and light indeed, but nothing else. houseless and homeless, they wander about with their wives and children. And it is with lying lips that their imperators exhort the soldiers in their battles to defend sepulchres and shrines from the enemy, for not a man of them has an hereditary altar, not one of all these many Romans an ancestral tomb, but they fight and die to support others in wealth and luxury. And though they are styled masters of the world, they have not a single clod of earth that is their own. This is an old translation of Plutarch. It's Bernadotte Perrin, but I think it's great. I love this translation. Anyway, this is you can feel the emotional force of this, right? These people, these Italian sort of lower middle class folks, they're fighting in the army, and they're the imperators, the leaders of the army, and the patricians and the wealthy people, they're out there, giving them all this high-flown rhetoric about fighting for Rome, being masters of the land, being masters of the world. And Gracchus has a point when he says they're not masters of jack. They don't have anything. And he's ginning up what is already there, but bringing to the surface this tremendous frustration, justified in many cases, frustration about land theft. And Appian says, interestingly, in this is chapter 11 of his first book of the Civil War, Appian says the idea of Gracchus' scheme was to secure not prosperity, but population. We talked about this already, right? That the point here is not that you're going to get rich. The point is that you're going to at least have enough to have kids, and then Rome is not going to be reliant on these infusions of foreign labor that it just exploits in this kind of sickly way. So the crowd goes wild, of course, right? This is hugely popular, this Tiberian speech. However, Appian tells us that another tribune, remember there's 10 tribunes, so Tiberius is not the only one. There's another tribune named Octavius who is primed by the landholders, Appian says, to veto this law. And in Rome, the veto wins. Any magistrate can veto another magistrate at his level or below, and then you're done. There's no, you don't have to get certain support for the veto or whatever. And so this is it's just a huge smackdown, right? It's like you're going up for an easy layup, and then you just get totally denied the net by Octavius. And so you may imagine how incredibly frustrating that is. Already we have this great pent-up energy behind this bill, this law, this potential law. And so Tiberius goes to the Senate, which, is a good idea in general. The Senate is, again, even though they are not technically the source of sovereignty, they are in many cases how Rome gets run. And to make your case before the Senate is an important thing, and not to do it is kind of disrespectful. So Tiberius goes to the Senate, and they don't even give him the time of day. They basically just forestall and practically ignore him, because they're all the rich guys who stand to lose all that land, right? And so some of those guys are with Tiberius, but a lot of them are not. And obviously they have this great power to kind of shrug him off. The landholders have already sort of incited Octavius to shoot this thing down. And Tiberius is now, he must just be fuming, right? Because of course it's his own personal career that's at stake, as well as all of this popular agitation. And so Tiberius does something really crummy. This is kind of, in my view, this is Tiberius' first bad move. I have a lot of problems with Tiberius' law as it is that I'm going to get into, but this is where the first time he just lets his ambition and his demagoguery get the better of him. He puts off the vote in the Council of the Plebs for the next day. And he says that also on this next day, we're going to vote Octavius out of office. So he basically votes to deplatform his fellow tribune. Plutarch says this is illegal. It's a tremendously dramatic scene in Plutarch, very showy, in which Tiberius sort of has the different. Remember, this is the tributa, so there are 35 tribes, each casting their vote. And once you get to, I guess it would be 18, once you get to 18 votes, then you've won. And so they're voting to depose Octavius. And after each vote, Tiberius pleads with his friend Octavius, please, don't make me do this. And they have had they've had a passionate but good working relationship. They're kind of friendly rivals. And now he's basically kicking the guy to the curb. And, eventually it it works, right? Octavius is voted out. And Tiberius makes this tremendous show of being very upset and regretful about this, but his enemies do not buy it. And so now there's real resentment in Rome. There's kind of a Gracchan party, a pro-Tiberius party. Feels like they've gotten everything they want. And then there is an anti-Tiberius party composed of the rich and the people who are unsettled by the way that Tiberius is doing things. And these guys are not happy with each other. The next thing that kind of happens, interestingly, is that many of the Graccans are country farmers, and they go home, right? They go to farm the land, and that leaves Tiberius with this kind of problem of turnout as well. So there's a little anxiety on Tiberius' part. We're still in 133 BC. We're kind of, Tiberius feeling a little bit antsy, and everybody in Rome is feeling quite on edge. But the law is passed. The people have gotten everything that they wanted. However, you still have this problem of enforcement. How are you going to enforce this law? And in addition to the actual logistical problems, the rich are totally obstructionist. They deny Tiberius all sorts of kind of honors and benefits that would come with being a magistrate in an active role of this kind. And they make all of these sort of semi-valid complaints about, we don't know how to give this land back. In many cases, it was our fathers' fathers who sort of appropriated it. And what do you want us to do? Do you want us to give back the money that we made selling it? Like, how is this going to work? And there's this council of three people: Tiberius himself, his brother Gaius, whom again we're going to get to in a future episode, and then Appius Claudius, remember his father-in-law, this kind of elder statesman. And they're charged with enforcing the law, and it's just like it's kind of impossible to proceed. They kind of can't. And so as the year comes around and Tiberius is up to leave, because remember, he only has his office for 1 year, he stands for re-election to become tribune again and try to do this again. And there's some objection. There's a law, another law, the Lex Villa, passed in 180 BC, and that sort of said that other magistrates, like the consul, you can't stand in consecutive years for the same position. And there's not really, it actually doesn't say that you can't do this for the tribune of the plebs. We don't know that that's illegal, but it seems like it's just kind of not done. And it's one more thing that Tiberius is doing that makes people feel like, he's kind of cheating, basically. And there's a stalemate. People start to arm themselves. So this is another way that you can tell that things are not going well. Again, similarly to us, right? Like when people are selling out gun stores right now in defense against lawless rioting and looting, which again, whatever side of that conflict you take, I have a very definite side of it. I'm on the side of the people buying guns to defend their homes against looters. But whatever side of it you're on, it's not good, right? It's not healthy. And so this is just not a healthy regime when people are kind of arming themselves against their political opponents. I'm going to read now a portion of Appian that sort of tells us the resolution of this conflict, because it's so dramatic that we can just read the whole thing. Remember that Gracchus is trying now to get reelected, and I'm starting here at chapter 15. He says, the poor were overwhelmed with a feeling of great pity. So Gracchus is denied the reelection. He says they were overwhelmed with a feeling of great pity, along with some reflections, that as for themselves, they were no longer citizens equal under the law, but slaves to the power of the rich. And as for Gracchus, his great fear and suffering were a result of his concern for them. So again, remember, a person of genuine altruism in some senses, but also somebody that let the moment get the better of him to become this kind of demagogue. They escorted him home in a body that evening, the people did, lamenting and encouraging him to be optimistic about the next day. He took great heart, gathered together his partisans before it was yet light, and after indicating a signal to be used if it was necessary to fight, so he's fixing for a Donnybrook, right, occupied the temple and the center of the assembly place on the Capitoline, which is a hill in Rome, where the voting was to take place. When he was obstructed by the tribunes and the rich, who would not allow the voting procedure on the law to begin, he gave the signal. A shout suddenly came from those who were in the secret, and violence at once broke out. Some of Gracchus' supporters acted as a bodyguard to protect him, while others hitched up their clothing, snatched the rods and staves from the hands of the attendants, broke them in pieces, and drove the rich from the assembly. So great was the confusion and such the injuries that the tribunes deserted their places, the priests shut the temple, and large numbers of people ran wildly to escape It was also erroneously alleged by some that Gracchus had deposed the other tribunes, a guess based on their invisibility, and by others that he was making himself tribune for the following year without election. So now things are just really falling apart. The law is, he's basically proposing to, come back for another year and do this law again, but more, right? He's going to double down on doing this law. While this was happening, the Senate met in the Temple of Fides, the Temple of Fidelity in Latin. I am amazed, this is Appian, gives us a little comment, I am amazed that they never even thought of appointing a dictator, because they could do this in Rome. You could briefly appoint a dictator for some time, who just took charge of everything. Although they had often in crises of this sort found salvation in absolute power, and that the majority neither on that occasion nor subsequently so much as remembered that this course of action, which had proved most useful to their predecessors, was available to them. After taking their decisions, they went up to the Capitol. The first among them, leading the way, was the chief priest, as he is called, the Pontifex Maximus, Cornelius Scipio Nasica. The chief priest shouted that those who wanted to save their country should follow him, and threw the hem of his toga over his head. This may have been to induce more of them to accompany him by the distinctiveness of his dress, or to fashion for the onlookers some symbol of war like a helmet, or to hide from the gods his shame at what he proposed to do. So a brief note here, right? The Pontifex Maximus is not like your friendly Anglican priest, your sort of soft-spoken, mild-mannered pastor. This is like a very serious player in Rome. Roman religion was a state thing. It was, there were very specific rules about what to do and what was right, and seeking the help, the counsel, and the favor of the gods through the official priestly order was a central thing. So if the priest said it, it basically went, except that too is starting to break down a little bit. Appian doesn't mention the main reason probably why this guy puts his toga over his head, which is to assume a kind of official garb that gives his action the sort of posture of sacrifice. It's like he's making a sacrifice to the gods on behalf of the Roman state, which is amazing when you think about what comes next, right? He says, when he came up to the sanctuary and rushed at the Graccans, they gave way because they respected such a distinguished man and saw the senators following him. But the latter wrenched the staves from the very hands of the Graccans, broke up the benches and other equipment which had been brought for an assembly, and struck and chased the Graccans and drove them over the precipitous edges. In this rioting, many of the Graccans died, and Gracchus himself, trapped near the temple, was killed at the doorway beside the statues of the kings. All the bodies were thrown at night into the river. Thus endeth the story of Tiberius Gracchus, and not particularly pleasantly, right? So this is a man who has started to transgress the laws, and essentially the full force of the Roman elite is brought down upon him, and he is killed. So the beginning of the end, right? When that is happening, when the way that you are deciding your political conflicts is through open violence on the part of your elected officials, you know that you are in for the end. We're not there yet, right? I am not at all suggesting that is what is going on in America. I'm just noting that this is, that civil unrest has these kind of potentials. There are parallels here, but that is not destiny, right? So now let's take a little bit of time to just think about what the similarities are between this moment and ours, and whether we are therefore locked into the disasters that befell the Roman Empire. I do not think we are, but let's get into that in a moment. As Plutarch says, Tiberius was kind of nice at first about this law. He was dealing with law breaking. He was proposing a legal remedy to it. But it just was not a workable solution. So this is Theodore Mommsen, who is, to my mind, the great modern historian of Rome. Late 1800s, early 1900s, winner of the Nobel Prize. I think he really gets this right. He says, after telling this whole story of Tiberius, he says, let us endeavor to form a judgment regarding these momentous events. The appointment of an official commission, which had to counteract the dangerous diminution of the farmer class by the comprehensive establishment of new small holdings from the whole Italian landed properties. This is Gracchus's law. At the disposal of the state was doubtless no sign of a healthy condition of the national economy, but it was, under the existing circumstances, political and social, suited to its purpose. The distribution of the domains, moreover, was in itself no political party question. It might have been carried out to the last sod without changing the existing constitution at all or shaking the government of the aristocracy. As little could there be, in that case, any complaint of a violation of rights. The state was confessedly the owner of the occupied land. The holder as a possessor on mere sufferance could not, as a rule, ascribe to himself even a bona fide proprietary tenure. And in the exceptional instances where he could do so, he was confronted by the fact that by the Roman law, prescription did not run against the state. So Mommsen is saying basically this is legal, and the problem is real. He says, but the attempt now to carry out these legal claims of the state was far from being politically warranted by the circumstance that the distribution of the domains neither infringed the existing constitution nor involved a violation of right. Such objections have now then been raised in our day, when a great landlord suddenly begins to assert in all their compass claims belonging to him in law, but suffered for a long period to lie dormant in practice, might with equal and better right be advanced against the rogation. We're going to cut this sentence. These occupied domains had been undeniably inheritable private possessions, some of them for 300 years, the state's proprietorship of the soil, which from its very nature loses more readily than that of the burgess the character of a private right, had, in the case of these lands, become virtually extinct, and the present holders had universally come to their possessions by purchase or other onerous acquisition. So he's saying, Mommsen, no less an authority than Mommsen, is telling you exactly what I've been telling you this whole time, which is it just doesn't work. It doesn't matter if it's hypothetically a good idea, if the law has been broken in the past, you just can't go back and undo it. It's just, however tempting it may be, you can't make it happen. And so this is, to me, this is the great lesson of this time. And it is why a good man like Tiberius Gracchus was driven to demagoguery, and eventually Rome was driven by him to civil unrest. It's not because Tiberius was especially evil. It's because he was trying to force the hands of time backward on a ship that had already sailed, to mix two metaphors at once, right? He was trying to undo history. And if that were possible, it would be the best solution to every problem. If you could turn the clock back, that would fix absolutely everything. There is no issue that you couldn't solve by going back to the time before the issue arose. But it ain't working that way, folks. We're trying that right now in the States. All of this stuff about reparations, right, for example, to make up for the generational injustice of slavery, ain't gonna happen, right? I mean, it won't be enough. It'll never be enough. What can we do differently? What can we do besides try this old, outdated way of going back and undoing the past? Well, to me, the answer is always outward and it's always forward. That's how Rome initially got great, is by expanding its territory outward and getting more land for its people to cultivate. That's how we in America initially got great. We had the Homestead Act in this country. We moved out and Americans got more land because they were the ones that were going to be working it and producing good stuff on it. I mentioned the illegal immigration crisis. Of course, another major issue with us right now is the outsourcing of jobs, where basically tech giants can have their own form of near slave labor, right? We talked about the Italian slaves that had to work the land of the rich in ancient Rome. Our major tech corporations have their own kind of foreign slaves. They have slaves or quasi-slaves in these countries that have no labor regulations, and they have to pay them a pittance compared with the people that they claim to be serving with all of their woke dogma, right? Oh yes, we're so virtuous, but of course what we're actually doing is taking your jobs overseas. So look, that's not gonna work. This kind of sclerotic going back, undoing the past. The answer is always outward. I don't know where exactly. I suspect it's in space, right? I think the thing that gives me the most hope right now is honestly Elon Musk and SpaceX. But whatever it is, it's got to be forward. The irony of this whole episode is that by looking into the past, we learn that what we must do is leave the past behind us in this moment. There must be some way outward to expand and get bigger, to have more babies, get more land, more territory, more stuff. That's the answer here, not this kind of death of looking backward. All right, I hope that gives you some hope for this moment, because it's a mess, but I actually don't think it's the end of the story. We are going to do the mailbag now. Somebody asked me a really interesting question that I think a lot about myself, so I thought I would deal with it here. He said, what was the relationship between the Greeks and freedom? Because in America, of course, we're all about liberty. We're all about individual personal liberty. And we tend to look back to the Greeks as the founders of democracy and in many ways our forebears in that regard. But did they actually believe in freedom the way we believe in freedom? And my answer to that is yes and no. They believed in freedom the way we initially believed in freedom, but we've forgotten what they knew about freedom. We think that freedom means do whatever the heck you want. And it doesn't matter, right, whether you do one thing or another. As long as you don't hurt anybody, you do this or that, you drink 50 cans of beer or you go to the gym, like that's just your choice, your body, your choice. And that is not at all the end of the story on freedom. There is an amazing passage in Herodotus, who was the great historian of the Greek and Persian wars, which we talked about on another episode. And Herodotus tells the story of an exiled Spartan king, so a Greek king, Demaratus, who ends up in the retinue of Xerxes, the Persian emperor. And Xerxes is surveying his massive army and saying, how can the Greeks possibly stand up against me? And Demaratus says, you know what, Xerxes, they're going to fight you until the very last man is dead. And I don't think your guys are going to fight like that, because your guys fear you. But the Greeks love their freedom and they love their laws. We always stop at the freedom part of that quote, right? Oh yeah, rah, go Spartans, freedom, But we forget that it's part of a two-part relationship, freedom and laws. We love to be able to do what we want, and the way we can do what we want is by structuring our society such that each individual is raised to believe in the goodness and the virtue of law and order and decency, right? That is the ancient model of freedom. And it eventually fell apart, just like ours is falling apart. But if we are looking for some way to reclaim that wisdom from the past, remember Demaratus, remember freedom and the laws. That's the point, right? Don't forget the and the laws part. All right. That's it for this episode of Young Heretics. As always, it has been a total pleasure to be with you. Thanks especially to my employers at the Claremont Institute, who are fantastic in so many ways, but especially because they help out with me doing this awesome podcast, which I love to do. And if you like this show, you will probably love the Claremont Institute's work. We put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and The American Mind. You can also donate to us. I think it's really important in this moment, especially, to support the work that we do at the Claremont Institute, recovering the American idea. And so you can go to claremont.org/donate. If you do, tell them we sent you. Mention that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics in the notes. Thanks again so much for watching and listening. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.